Millionaire followed the maid who always snuck away at lunchtime, and is stunned by what he sees. Julian Sterling watched from the window of his executive penthouse office, his hands trembling with irritation. It was the third time that week that Sarah Miller had rushed out of his sprawling estate exactly at noon, claiming she needed to have lunch at home. The businessman couldn't understand why a simple domestic worker was in such a hurry to leave work at lunchtime, especially when he offered full meals to all staff. It was when the clock struck 12 on the dot that the young woman in her 20s appeared in the garden, walking hurriedly toward the gate. Julian watched her from the large second-floor window, noting how she looked around before leaving, almost as if she were hiding something. The suspicion that had been growing in his chest in recent days finally took concrete form. Sarah had started working in his home just 3 months ago, recommended by the most expensive, exclusive domestic staffing agency in the small coastal town in Maine where he lived. She was different from the other workers he had hired, punctual, dedicated, never complained about hard work, and always finished her tasks with impressive efficiency. But that daily escape at noon was starting to bother him deeply. Julian descended the marble stairs of his sprawling estate with determined steps. At 42, he had built an empire in the tropical fruit export business, turning a small family operation into a company that served international markets. His wealth allowed him to live in one of the most luxurious homes in the area, but it had also taught him to be wary of the intentions of people around him. He grabbed the keys to his most discreet car, a black sedan that wouldn't draw attention, and left through the back garage. Sarah had already turned the corner when he managed to spot her walking down the main street. He kept his distance, driving slowly as he watched her take streets he had never explored, despite having lived in that town for over a decade. The young woman walked with determination, carrying a plastic bag that seemed heavy. Julian noticed she had changed out of her work uniform into simple clothes, a light pink blouse, and a dark skirt that made her look even younger. Her brown hair was tied in a high ponytail, and she walked with an upright posture that showed purpose. After 15 minutes of walking, Sarah arrived at a square that Julian vaguely recognized. It was a place away from the town center, surrounded by modest houses and small local shops. Some leafy trees offered shade for wooden benches scattered around, and a small children's playground occupied one corner of the square. Julian parked across the street, behind a delivery van that provided perfect camouflage. From where he was, he could clearly observe what was happening in the square. Sarah walked directly toward a bench where a figure was sitting, almost hidden by the shadow of a large tree. It was then that Julian saw something that made his heart race. The figure on the bench was an elderly woman, with unkempt gray hair, wearing worn-out clothes that seemed not to have been washed for weeks. She was hunched forward, with slumped shoulders, in a posture that showed weariness and resignation. She was clearly a homeless person, a reality Julian knew existed, but from which he had always kept his distance. Sarah approached the woman carefully, as if not wanting to startle her. She opened the bag she was carrying and began taking out containers that appeared to hold hot food. The aroma even reached Julian across the street, making him realize she had prepared a full meal. The maid sat beside the elderly woman on the bench and began serving the food onto disposable plates. Her demeanor was gentle, almost maternal as she offered the food to the older woman. Julian watched, fascinated and confused, while Sarah chatted animatedly with the lady, who seemed to respond with timid gestures and occasional smiles. It was a completely unexpected scene. The maid he had hired to care for his home was using her lunch break to feed a stranger in a vulnerable situation. Julian felt a mix of astonishment and something he couldn't immediately identify. Perhaps it was admiration, or maybe just curiosity about the reasons behind that gesture. He continued watching as Sarah helped the elderly woman eat, delicately wiping her face when necessary. The young woman had also brought a thermos with what appeared to be hot coffee, and she offered a cup to the older woman, who accepted it with trembling but grateful hands. The entire time Sarah maintained a steady conversation, gesturing and smiling in a way Julian rarely saw in his home. There in the simple square, surrounded only by ordinary people and a lady living on the streets, his maid displayed a genuine joy that contrasted with the more reserved demeanor she maintained during work. Dear listener, If you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. Julian realized there was something deeply personal in that interaction. It wasn't just charity or a sporadic act of kindness. The way Sarah behaved suggested an established relationship, a care that had been practiced long enough to create familiarity between the two women. The elderly woman, in turn, seemed to eagerly await Sarah's arrival. Even from a distance, Julian could see how her face lit up whenever the young woman spoke, and how she held Sarah's hand between her own wrinkled hands in a gesture of affection and gratitude. It was then that something extraordinary happened. The older woman lifted her face to speak to Sarah, and for a moment the sunlight fully illuminated her features. Julian felt as if the world had stopped around him. That face, even marked by age and hardship, was unmistakably familiar. It was Mrs. Margaret Abernathy, his fifth-grade literature teacher, the woman who had marked his childhood with passionate lessons about poetry and who always insisted on the importance of human values over material ones. The teacher who used to say her students had the potential to change the world, if only they remembered to be good to one another. Julian felt his legs go weak. How was it possible that his former teacher, a woman he remembered as elegant and full of energy, was now living on the streets? And how had Sarah found her? Was it a coincidence, or was there some deeper connection he was unaware of? Thousands of questions flooded his mind as he continued observing the scene. Mrs. Margaret didn't seem to have recognized Sarah from some school context, as the young maid was clearly too young to have been her student, but the intimacy between them suggested they had known each other for at least a few weeks. Sarah finished feeding Mrs. Margaret and began putting the empty containers back in her bag. Before saying goodbye, she hugged the teacher affectionately and whispered something in her ear that made her smile. Julian saw when his maid discreetly left a small envelope in the elderly woman's hands, who quickly hid it among her clothes. The farewell was affectionate but brief. Sarah needed to return to work before her absence was noticed. She rose from the bench, adjusted her clothes, and began walking back toward Julian's sprawling estate. Mrs. Margaret watched her leave with a sad smile, waving until the young woman disappeared from view. Julian remained in the car for a few more minutes, watching Mrs. Margaret alone on the bench. The teacher now seemed smaller, more fragile, as if Sarah's departure had taken away part of her energy. She carefully packed away the leftover food and settled on the bench in a way that suggested she would spend the rest of the afternoon there. When he finally decided to head back home, Julian was completely unsettled. His mind couldn't properly process what he had witnessed. The housekeeper he had hired simply to keep his home clean and organized was, in fact, dedicating part of her time and her limited resources to care for someone who clearly had no one else in the world. And it wasn't just anyone. It was Mrs. Margaret, the teacher who had planted in his young mind the first seeds of compassion and social responsibility. The woman who used to say that true education wasn't just in books, but in the ability to look around and help those in need. Julian arrived at the estate just a few minutes before Sarah returned. He quickly went up to his executive penthouse office and pretended to be working when he heard her enter through the kitchen door. She greeted the other staff normally and returned to her duties as if nothing extraordinary had happened. For the rest of the afternoon, Julian couldn't concentrate on anything. He watched Sarah working through the house with a completely new perspective. Every gesture of hers now seemed loaded with meaning. The dedication with which she cleaned and organized, the respectful way she treated the other staff, the care she took with the house's objects, all of it took on a different dimension after what he had witnessed. When night fell, Julian found himself walking through the house aimlessly, lost in thoughts he couldn't organize. His usual routine of dining alone while watching financial news lost all meaning. The headlines about markets and investments seemed trivial compared to the image of Mrs. Margaret accepting food from Sarah's hands. He tried to remember the last time he had thought of Mrs. Margaret. It had probably been years, perhaps decades. Like most people, he had moved on with his life after leaving school, focusing on building his career and fortune, leaving behind the people who had contributed to his formation. Now discovering that one of those people was living in such precarious conditions made him question many of his choices. He had become exactly the type of successful person Mrs. Margaret probably hoped her students would become, but he had completely failed to embody the values she had tried so hard to teach. The night was long and restless for Julian. He lay awake going over school memories and trying to understand how Mrs. Margaret had ended up in that situation. He also couldn't stop thinking about Sarah and the reasons that led her to dedicate so much care to a stranger. The next morning, Julian decided he needed to find out more about the situation. When Sarah arrived for work, he watched her with renewed attention, looking for signs that could explain her connection to Mrs. Margaret. But the young woman maintained her usual professional demeanor, greeting him respectfully before starting her tasks. It was then that Julian noticed something he had overlooked before. In the small bag Sarah carried to work, there were always empty containers that she took away at the end of the day. He had assumed she took leftovers home, which was a common practice and one he allowed. Now he realized she was probably preparing meals at home specifically for Mrs. Margaret. The discovery made him feel a mixture of admiration and guilt. Admiration for Sarah's generosity, who clearly earned a modest salary, but chose to share her resources with someone even more in need. Guilt for never having considered using his own abundance of resources to help people in similar situations. Julian began to pay attention to other details he had previously ignored. Sarah always brought extra ingredients when shopping for the house, saying she was taking advantage of promotions. She often asked to leave a few minutes early, citing family commitments, and she always seemed particularly cheerful in the mornings, as if she were eager for the moment she could leave work to do something more meaningful. All these small observations fit perfectly with what he had discovered at Willow Creek Square. Sarah was using her limited resources and her free time to keep Mrs. Margaret fed and cared for. It was an act of pure kindness, with no expectation of recognition or reward. When lunchtime came, Julian pretended to be busy on an important call while watching Sarah get ready to leave. As always, she changed clothes quickly and left with her characteristic bag. This time, he didn't follow her. He didn't need to. He knew exactly where she was going and what she was doing. Instead, Julian spent the lunch hour thinking about what he should do with this information. His first reaction had been surprise and confusion. Now, after a whole night of reflection, he felt compelled to act in some way. But he wasn't sure what the right approach would be. He could confront Sarah directly, revealing that he knew about her activities, but that would likely make her embarrassed and defensive. He could offer financial help, but that could be interpreted as condescension. Or he could try to approach Mrs. Margaret directly, but that would be a violation of both their privacy. As he pondered his options, Julian realized something disturbing. In all his years as a successful businessman, he had rarely faced a dilemma that couldn't be solved with money or influence. This situation was different. It required sensitivity, compassion, and an understanding of human dynamics that he had neglected to develop. When Sarah returned from lunch, she looked particularly radiant. There was a glow in her eyes that Julian began to associate with the moments after her visits to the square. It was as if she came back renewed, with a sense of purpose that domestic work, however well performed, could not provide. During the afternoon, Julian watched Sarah work with growing admiration. Every task she performed was done with a care that went beyond professional obligation. She cleaned as if she were caring for something that belonged to her, organized with the meticulousness of someone who truly cared about the final result. It was then that Julian realized a painful irony in his situation. He had hired Sarah to take care of his house and his material needs, but she was in fact teaching him lessons about care and compassion that he had forgotten he needed to learn. In the following days, Julian developed a routine of discreet observation. He no longer followed Sarah to the square, but monitored her schedules and behaviors, trying to better understand the extent of her commitment to Mrs. Margaret. He discovered that she always prepared extra food when cooking at home, always checked the weather forecast before leaving for lunch, and often made small purchases of items that were clearly not for personal use. One afternoon, while organizing some old papers in his executive penthouse office, Julian found a school yearbook from when he was in 5th grade. He flipped through the pages until he found the class photo and there was Mrs. Margaret, young and smiling, surrounded by her students. He recognized himself as a boy with messy hair in the front row, smiling at the camera with the typical innocence of that age. The photo unleashed a flood of memories that had been dormant for decades. Mrs. Margaret wasn't just a literature teacher. She had been a mentor, someone who saw potential in every student and strove to cultivate it. Julian remembered how she used to stay after school to help struggling students, and how she always found creative ways to make learning interesting. He also remembered a specific occasion when Mrs. Margaret had organized a food drive for needy families in the region. She had taught the students that true education included the responsibility to care for one another. At the time, Julian had participated in the drive only because it was mandatory. Now, decades later, he was witnessing the fruits of that education in how Sarah cared for the very teacher who had planted those seeds. The irony of the situation became even more evident. Mrs. Margaret had taught about compassion and social responsibility, but now she was the one who needed the compassion of others. And the person demonstrating that compassion hadn't been one of her students, but a young woman who simply recognized a need and decided to act. Julian began to question his own responsibilities in the situation. He had been Mrs. Margaret's student, had benefited from her teachings, and had built a prosperous life. Shouldn't he feel some obligation to repay the care she had dedicated to his education? But the more he thought about it, the more Julian realized his motivations shouldn't be based solely on gratitude or obligation. Mrs. Margaret was in a situation of need, and he had abundant resources to help. The question wasn't whether he should help, but how to do it in a way that respected her dignity and didn't interfere with the special relationship she had developed with Sarah. 1 week after his initial discovery, Julian made a decision. He would approach the situation, but indirectly. Instead of confronting Sarah or Mrs. Margaret directly, he would begin by observing Willow Creek Square, where they met more closely, trying to better understand the dynamics of the situation and identify specific ways he could contribute. That afternoon, he arrived at Willow Creek Square about half an hour before Sarah's usual lunchtime. He parked in a different spot, where he could observe without being noticed, and began to study the environment more attentively. The square was clearly a meeting point for several people in socially vulnerable situations. Besides Mrs. Margaret, there were other individuals who also seemed to lack stable housing. Julian noticed the square had some basic infrastructure deficiencies. The benches were in poor condition, there were no working water fountains, and the nighttime lighting seemed inadequate. They were problems that could be solved with relatively small investments, but would make a significant difference in the quality of life for the people who frequented the place. When Sarah arrived for her daily meeting with Mrs. Margaret, Julian observed the interaction with renewed attention. This time, he noticed details that had escaped him before. Mrs. Margaret seemed to have better and worse days. At times, she chatted animatedly with Sarah, showing lucidity and interest. At others, she seemed confused and distant. He also observed that other people in the square recognized Sarah and greeted her respectfully. It was evident that her kindness wasn't limited to just Mrs. Margaret. She was known and respected by the entire small community that had formed in that space. This discovery made Julian reflect on the nature of true influence. He had built a business empire and was respected in the region's economic circles. But his influence was based primarily on financial power and social position. Sarah, on the other hand, had built an influence based on genuine compassion and concrete acts of care. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially to subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. In the following days, Julian continued his discreet observations, gradually developing a more complete understanding of the situation. He discovered that Mrs. Margaret had particularly difficult days when she seemed not to recognize Sarah or showed signs of mental confusion. In these moments, the young woman demonstrated infinite patience, repeating information when necessary and maintaining an always gentle and comforting tone. Julian also noticed that Sarah had established a carefully planned routine. She always checked the weather conditions and adjusted the type of food she brought according to the day's temperature. On colder days, she brought soups and hot teas. On warmer days, she prepared fresh salads and iced juices. It was a level of attention and care that demonstrated genuine commitment. One afternoon, while observing the usual routine, Julian witnessed something that moved him deeply. Mrs. Margaret was having one of her most difficult days, seeming not to recognize Sarah initially. The young woman sat patiently beside her and began to talk about simple things: the weather, the flowers in Willow Creek Square, the birds singing in the trees. Gradually, Mrs. Margaret began to respond, first with timid gestures and then with words. It was like watching someone being gently brought back to the present through another person's patience and affection. The transformation was subtle but profound, and Julian realized he was witnessing a form of therapy based purely on human love. At that moment, Julian made a definitive decision. He could no longer remain just a passive observer. He needed to find a way to contribute to that situation, not only out of gratitude to Mrs. Margaret, but because he had witnessed something that inspired him to be a better person. The following night, Julian began researching senile dementia and care for elderly people experiencing homelessness. He discovered that Mrs. Margaret's situation was not isolated. Many elderly people ended up on the streets due to a combination of family problems, mental health issues, and a lack of adequate social support. He also researched local organizations working with vulnerable people, trying to understand what kind of support was already available and where there were gaps that could be filled. He discovered the town had limited resources and that most aid initiatives depended on volunteers and private donations. This research gave Julian an idea of how he could begin to contribute without directly interfering in the relationship between Sarah and Mrs. Margaret. He could support existing organizations or create new initiatives that would benefit not only Mrs. Margaret, but others in the same situation. However, he knew that any action he took should be carefully planned. His position as Sarah's employer created a complex dynamic that could easily become awkward or problematic if not handled with sensitivity. Julian decided to start with small indirect gestures. He began leaving extra ingredients in the kitchen, ostensibly for the staff to use at home, but knowing Sarah would likely use them to prepare food for Mrs. Margaret. He also started making anonymous donations to local organizations that worked with people experiencing homelessness. These actions gave him a satisfaction he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, Julian felt he was using his wealth for something that truly mattered. It wasn't the same satisfaction that came from a successful business deal or a profitable acquisition. It was something deeper, more connected to values he had forgotten he possessed. One morning, while Sarah was preparing breakfast, Julian decided to subtly test whether she would notice the extra ingredients he was providing. He casually remarked about having bought more food than necessary and suggested she take the excess home. Sarah's reaction was immediate and genuine. Her eyes lit up with gratitude, but she tried to politely refuse, saying she already received a fair salary and didn't need charity. The response revealed as much about her character as it did about her financial situation. She clearly valued her independence and dignity, even when facing difficulties. Julian gently insisted, explaining that it would be wasteful to throw food away and that she would be doing him a favor by accepting. Finally, Sarah agreed, though with evident discomfort. He realized he would need to be more subtle in future offers of help, respecting her pride and her need to keep the professional relationship on clear terms. Over the following weeks, Julian continued his observations and his indirect contributions. Gradually, he began to notice subtle changes in Mrs. Margaret's appearance. She seemed to be eating better, her clothes were cleaner, and there were moments when she seemed more alert and present. It was evident that Sarah's consistent care was making a difference in her quality of life. But Julian also noticed that Sarah was beginning to look tired. The effort of working full-time and still dedicating her free time to caring for Mrs. Margaret was clearly taking its toll. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she occasionally seemed distracted during work. This observation made Julian realize that the situation, while admirable, was not sustainable in the long term. Sarah was sacrificing herself in a way that could eventually harm her own health and well-being. It was necessary to find a more comprehensive solution that would allow Mrs. Margaret to receive the care she needed without depleting Sarah's physical and emotional resources. It was then that Julian decided it was time to take more direct action. But he knew he needed to approach the situation with extreme care, respecting the feelings of all the people involved and preserving each person's dignity. His first idea was to approach Sarah directly about the situation, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized this could create an awkward situation for her. Sarah had clearly chosen to keep her charitable activities private, and exposing this knowledge might make her feel violated or judged. His second idea was to approach Mrs. Margaret directly, but this also presented problems. The teacher probably wouldn't recognize him after so many years, and the revelation that he had been observing her interactions with Sarah could frighten her or make her suspicious. Finally, Julian decided the best approach would be to create a situation where he could discover the circumstances in a seemingly accidental way. This would allow him to offer help naturally, without suggesting he had been investigating Sarah's activities. The plan he devised was simple but effective. He would create an excuse to be in the Willow Creek Square area during lunch hour, allowing him to bump into Sarah and Mrs. Margaret by chance. This would give him the opportunity to get involved in the situation organically, offering help as a spontaneous response to what he had discovered. On the morning he decided to implement his plan, Julian felt a nervousness he hadn't experienced in years. He was used to high-stakes negotiations and complex business decisions, but this situation required a different kind of courage. It was the courage to be vulnerable, to admit he had learned something important from his housekeeper and that he wanted to do the right thing. He created a plausible excuse to be at the square, a meeting with a local supplier that had been cancelled at the last minute. He arrived at the square a few minutes before Sarah's usual time, parked in a visible spot, and pretended to be making work calls from his car. When Sarah arrived with her characteristic tote bag, Julian felt his heart race. He was about to cross a line he had been avoiding for weeks. Once he got directly involved in the situation, there would be no going back. His relationship with Sarah would inevitably change, and he wasn't sure how she would react. He watched as Sarah approached Mrs. Margaret on the usual bench. The teacher was having one of her more difficult days, seeming particularly confused and agitated. Sarah sat beside her and began her gentle routine of calming her and guiding her back to the present. It was then that Julian realized he had chosen the perfect moment to reveal himself. Mrs. Margaret clearly needed more help than Sarah could provide alone, and his intervention could be seen as a necessary response to an emergency, not as unwanted meddling. He got out of the car and walked toward the bench, trying to look surprised upon recognizing his housekeeper. Sarah saw him approaching and visibly tensed, clearly wondering how to explain her presence there with a homeless person. "Sarah," called Julian, feigning surprise, "what are you doing here?" The young woman stood up quickly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She glanced rapidly between Julian and Mrs. Margaret, clearly trying to think of an explanation that wouldn't reveal the full truth of the situation. "Mr. Julian," she said, her voice trembling slightly, I was just helping this lady who seemed to need—" "It's all right," Julian interrupted gently, sensing her discomfort. "You don't need to explain." He approached the bench and looked directly at Mrs. Margaret. Even with the marks of age and hardship, he could still recognize the features of the teacher he had known decades ago. "Actually," he continued, his voice growing softer, "I think I recognize this lady. Mrs. Margaret, isn't it?" Mrs. Margaret's reaction was immediate but confused. She looked at Julian with a mixture of recognition and uncertainty, as if she knew she should know him but couldn't quite place where or when. "You know me?" she asked, her voice frail but full of hope. "Yes," replied Julian, carefully sitting on the bench beside her. "I was your student, Julian Sterling, 5th grade, Class B. That was a long time ago." For a moment, Mrs. Margaret's face lit up with surprising clarity. It was as if the fog of confusion had momentarily lifted, allowing her to return fully to the present. "Julian!" she exclaimed, her voice gaining strength. "My little Julian, you've grown into such a handsome man." The emotion in her voice touched Julian in a way he hadn't expected. Tears began to form in his eyes as he realized that, despite all the difficulties she had faced, Mrs. Margaret still maintained the ability to find joy in reuniting with a former student. Sarah observed the interaction with a mixture of surprise and relief. It was evident she hadn't expected her employer to know Mrs. Margaret, but the revelation seemed to have resolved her dilemma about how to explain the situation. "Mrs. Margaret," said Julian softly, holding her hand between his. "What happened? How did you end up here?" The question brought a shadow of sadness to the teacher's face. For a moment, she seemed to struggle to organize her thoughts, as if trying to piece together scattered fragments of memory. I got lost," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "After I retired, things got difficult. My family, they couldn't take care of me anymore. I got so confused that I ended up leaving home and couldn't find my way back." The explanation broke Julian's heart. It was a tragically common story. An elderly person with mental health issues who had become lost both literally and figuratively, ending up on the streets due to a combination of unfortunate circumstances and a lack of adequate support. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "I don't know," Mrs. Margaret replied, her confusion returning. "The days all blend together, but this young woman," she pointed to Sarah, "has been an angel to me. She brings me food every day and talks with me. Without her, I don't know what would have happened." Julian looked at Sarah, who was clearly moved by Mrs. Margaret's affectionate description of her. It was evident the relationship between the two had become deeply meaningful for both. "How long have you known Mrs. Margaret?" Julian asked Sarah. "About 2 months," she replied. "I found her here one afternoon when I was passing through Willow Creek Square. She seemed so lost and frightened that I couldn't just walk away and ignore her." "And you've been coming here every day since then?" Sarah nodded, her embarrassment returning slightly. "I know I should have asked for permission to use my lunch break this way, but—" "No," Julian interrupted firmly. "You don't need to apologize for doing a good thing. In fact, I should be thanking you for looking after the teacher who meant so much to my education." The statement visibly relieved Sarah's tension. For the first time since Julian had arrived, she seemed to relax completely. "Mrs. Margaret," said Julian, turning his attention back to the teacher, "do you remember the lessons you used to teach, about how important it was to care for one another?" Her face lit up again. "Oh yes, I always told my students that true education wasn't just in books. It was about learning to be good people, to help those in need." "Do you remember the food drive we organized once?" "The drive?" Mrs. Margaret clapped her hands with childlike joy. "We collected so many donations. You children were so proud to help the families in need." Julian was touched by the vivid memory she still held of that specific event. It was evident that teaching about compassion had been a central part of her educational philosophy, and that she still cherished those memories even amid her mental confusion. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I want to help you. You shouldn't be living here in the square. Let me find a better place for you to stay." But her reaction was immediate and unexpected. She recoiled, gripping Sarah's hand tightly. "No," she said, her voice becoming agitated. "I don't want to leave here. This is my place now, and if I go away, how will Sarah find me?" Her resistance presented a dilemma that Julian had not anticipated. He had assumed that Mrs. Margaret would be grateful for an offer of more suitable housing, but it was evident that she had developed an emotional attachment to Willow Creek Square, and especially to the routine she had established with Sarah. "Mrs. Margaret," Sarah said softly, "Mr. Julian is trying to help you. He wants you to have a safe place to sleep, regular meals, medical care." "But I have you," Mrs. Margaret interrupted, her voice laden with emotion. "You bring me food every day. You talk with me. What more do I need?" The question revealed a complicated truth about the situation. For Mrs. Margaret, the emotional care and human connection she received from Sarah were more valuable than any material comfort Julian could offer. She had found something in the square that transcended her basic physical needs. Julian realized that resolving the situation would be more complex than he had imagined. It wasn't simply a matter of providing material resources, but of finding a way to preserve the special connection that had developed between Sarah and Mrs. Margaret, while still ensuring she received the care she needed. "All right," he said finally. "We won't force anything, but let me at least start by bringing some things that could make your stay here more comfortable." Mrs. Margaret seemed to consider the offer carefully. "What kind of things?" "Warmer blankets for the cold nights. Perhaps a more comfortable chair than this bench. An umbrella for rainy days." "That would be nice," she admitted timidly. "Sometimes I get very cold at night." Sarah looked at Julian with a mixture of gratitude and relief. It was evident that she had been worried about Mrs. Margaret's well-being during the nights, but didn't have the resources to provide basic items of comfort and protection. "And perhaps," Julian continued, "we could arrange for you to receive regular medical care, not necessarily in a hospital, but someone could come here to check on your health." "As long as Sarah keeps coming to see me," said Mrs. Margaret firmly. "Of course," Julian assured her. "Sarah can keep coming here whenever she wants." The conversation was interrupted when it began to rain lightly. Mrs. Margaret looked at the sky with worry, and Julian realized she had no adequate protection from the weather. "Come on," he said, helping her up. "Let's find a covered spot until the rain passes." They moved to a small pavilion in the square that offered basic protection. As they waited for the rain to ease, Julian observed Mrs. Margaret's overall condition more closely. Her clothes were clean, evidently washed by Sarah, but they were inadequate for life outdoors. Her shoes were worn, and likely didn't offer enough protection from the damp. "Sarah," he said quietly, while Mrs. Margaret was distracted watching the rain, "you've been incredible taking care of her, but this must be very difficult for you too." "It's nothing," she replied quickly. "I do it because I want to." "I know, and that makes your actions even more admirable, but let me help. You shouldn't have to carry this responsibility alone." Sarah hesitated, clearly torn between pride and the recognition that she could use help. "I don't want her to become just another charity project for you," she said finally. "She's a special person who deserves respect and dignity." Her concern touched Julian deeply. It showed that Sarah understood the difference between genuine charity and superficial gestures of guilt or social obligation. "You're right," he said. "Mrs. Margaret is special. She was my teacher, and her lessons on compassion shaped much of what I was supposed to become." Helping her isn't charity. It's an opportunity to finally put into practice what she tried to teach me so many years ago. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The rain stopped and they returned to the bench where Mrs. Margaret felt most comfortable. Julian realized he only had a few minutes before Sarah needed to return to work, so he decided to be direct about his next steps. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, "I'd like to come back tomorrow to bring some things that might help you feel more comfortable here. Would that be all right with you?" "If Sarah says you're a good person, then it's all right," she replied, looking affectionately at the young woman. "He is a good person," Sarah confirmed, "and he really was your student. I can see in his eyes the same kindness you always say we should look for in people." Sarah's approval meant more to Julian than any professional praise he had ever received. She had spent months observing and caring for Mrs. Margaret, and her ability to judge character had become refined through that experience. When it was time for Sarah to return to work, the farewell was warmer than usual. Mrs. Margaret held both their hands for a moment, as if blessing a new alliance that had formed. "Take care of each other," she said with surprising clarity, "and don't forget to take care of yourselves too. Kindness can only flow from hearts that are well tended." On the way back to the sprawling estate, Julian and Sarah walked together in a comfortable silence. The morning's discovery had fundamentally changed the dynamic between them, but in a way that felt natural and positive. "Thank you," Sarah finally said, "for understanding and for wanting to help." "Thank you," Julian replied, "for showing me how to put into practice the values I'd forgotten I had." That afternoon, Julian couldn't focus on work. Instead, he spent the time researching dementia care, essential items for people living outdoors, and in-home medical services in the region. He was determined to create a support plan for Mrs. Margaret that respected her wish to remain in Willow Creek Square while significantly improving her quality of life. He also began thinking about the broader implications of the situation. If Mrs. Margaret had ended up on the streets due to a combination of mental health issues and a lack of family support, there were likely other people in similar situations in the town. Perhaps his help for her could serve as a model for wider initiatives. The next morning, Julian arrived at the square with his car loaded with supplies. He had professional-grade blankets, a comfortable camping chair, a first aid kit, a large umbrella, and several changes of weather-appropriate clothing. He also brought a cooler with food prepared by his personal chef. Mrs. Margaret was visibly moved by the gifts, but what touched her most was the attention to detail Julian had shown. The clothes were the right size, the blankets were suitable for outdoor use, and the food included items she had mentioned she liked. "You remember I always liked chamomile tea?" she asked, holding a package he had included. "Of course," Julian lied gently. In truth, he had researched teas that helped with anxiety and sleep issues, but he knew she would be happy thinking he remembered personal details from decades ago. Sarah arrived for her usual lunch break and was impressed with the improvements Julian had implemented. The area around Mrs. Margaret's bench now looked more like a habitable space than a place of abandonment. "How did you manage all of this so quickly?" she asked. "When you have resources and motivation, it's surprising how much can be done in a short time," Julian replied. "The important thing is that Mrs. Margaret is more comfortable." Over the next few days, Julian established a new routine. He visited Mrs. Margaret every morning before work, bringing fresh coffee and checking if she had slept well. Sometimes he arrived at the same time as Sarah for lunch, and they shared the care of the teacher. The change in dynamics was positive for everyone involved. Mrs. Margaret benefited not only from the additional material support, but also from the extra company and mental stimulation that came from talking with two different people. Sarah felt relieved not to carry the entire responsibility alone anymore, and Julian discovered that caring for Mrs. Margaret gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for years. One morning, when Julian arrived at Willow Creek Square, he found Mrs. Margaret particularly agitated. She seemed confused about where she was and didn't immediately recognize either the square or the items he had provided for her comfort. "Where am I?" she asked repeatedly. "This is not my home. Why am I here?" Julian tried to calm her in the same way he had observed Sarah do, speaking softly and trying to guide her back to the present. But his efforts weren't as effective as hers, and Mrs. Margaret remained agitated. When Sarah arrived for lunch, she immediately noticed Mrs. Margaret's state and took control of the situation. With infinite patience, she held the teacher's hands and began talking about school memories, using techniques she had clearly developed through trial and error over the months. Gradually, Mrs. Margaret calmed down and began to recognize where she was and who was with her. The experience was a reminder for Julian that despite his resources and good intentions, there was still much he needed to learn about caring for someone with dementia. "How do you know exactly what to say to calm her?" he asked Sarah after Mrs. Margaret had stabilized. "Trial and error," she answered honestly, "and a lot of patience. Every person is different, and even the same person can be different from day to day. You learn to read the signs and respond accordingly." The answer made Julian realize that caring for Mrs. Margaret would require a long-term commitment and a significant learning curve. It wasn't simply a matter of providing material resources, but of developing specific skills and being consistently available. That afternoon, he began researching caregiver training for people with dementia. If he was going to take an active role in Mrs. Margaret's care, he wanted to do it as well as possible. He also began to consider the possibility of hiring a professional caregiver to complement the care he and Sarah provided. But he knew this would be a delicate conversation, especially considering Mrs. Margaret's previous resistance to changes in her established routine. During one of his morning visits, Julian decided to approach the subject carefully with Mrs. Margaret. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, "do you remember how you helped many students over the years when they were struggling?" "Oh, yes," she replied, her eyes lighting up. "It was the best part of my job, to see a child who was struggling finally understand something or gain confidence. There was no better feeling in the world. Well, now it's our turn to care for you in the same way you cared for your students. And sometimes, when we want to help someone as best we can, We need to bring in other people who have special knowledge. Mrs. Margaret considered this carefully. You're talking about bringing more people to help me. People who know how to help older people when they get confused sometimes, Julian explained gently. Not to replace Sarah or me, but to help us take better care of you. Would they be kind people, like you? Yes. I would make sure they were truly kind people who would understand how special you are. Mrs. Margaret nodded slowly. If you think it would be good for me, then I trust you. You were always a sensitive boy, even when you were little. The trust she showed in him was deeply moving. Julian realized there was an enormous responsibility in honoring that trust, ensuring that any additional caregiver he brought in would truly respect Mrs. Margaret's dignity and specific needs. In the following days, Julian began the process of finding and interviewing potential caregivers. He discovered that finding someone with the right qualities, patience, kindness, experience with dementia, and flexibility to work in an unconventional setting like a town square was more challenging than he had anticipated. Finally, through recommendations from a local geriatric clinic, he found Diane Miller, a retired nurse in her early 50s who had specialized in home care for people with dementia. During the interview, she demonstrated exactly the kind of patience and understanding Julian was looking for. Working in a town square would be unusual, admitted Diane, but if that's where the lady feels safe and happy, then that's where she should be. My job is to adapt the care to her needs, not the other way around. Her philosophy impressed Julian, and he decided to arrange a meeting between Diane and Mrs. Margaret to see how they would interact. The introduction was carefully planned. Julian arrived at the square at the usual time, followed shortly after by Diane, whom he introduced as a new friend who wanted to meet Mrs. Margaret. The casual approach worked perfectly, and within minutes the two women were talking as if they had known each other for years. Diane had a natural ability to connect with older people, and Mrs. Margaret responded positively to her presence. When Sarah arrived for lunch, the transition to include her in the conversation was smooth and natural. I like her, Mrs. Margaret said to Julian after Diane left. She reminds me of my younger sister. She was always good at taking care of people. Mrs. Margaret's endorsement was all Julian needed. He made arrangements for Diane to visit the square regularly, complementing the care he and Sarah already provided. The result was a comprehensive support system that ensured Mrs. Margaret always had someone checking on her well-being. With Diane taking on some of the medical and health care, Julian and Sarah could focus more on Mrs. Margaret's emotional and social needs. Julian began bringing poetry books to read to her, remembering how she had loved teaching literature. Sarah continued providing the regular meals and constant companionship that had become so important to the teacher's emotional well-being. The improvement in Mrs. Margaret's quality of life was evident. She had occasional bad days when mental confusion left her agitated, but she also had increasing periods of lucidity and contentment. Her physical condition improved dramatically with proper nutrition, regular medical care, and adequate protection from the elements. One afternoon, as Julian was reading poetry to Mrs. Margaret, she interrupted him with an observation that surprised him. "You've become exactly the man I hoped you would become," she said, her voice clear and focused. "When you were a boy, I saw kindness in you, but I also saw that you were afraid to show it. Now you're no longer afraid." The observation touched Julian deeply because he recognized the truth in it. During his youth and early adulthood, he had indeed suppressed his compassionate instincts, fearing they would be seen as weakness in the business world. Only through Sarah's example and the reunion with Mrs. Margaret had he rediscovered the courage to be genuinely kind. "And Sarah," continued Mrs. Margaret, looking at the young woman who was organizing the remains of lunch, "you are like I was when I began teaching, and full of love and determined to make a difference. Never lose that." The words created a moment of deep connection between the three. It was as if Mrs. Margaret, despite her condition, could clearly see the essence of both and validate the path they had chosen to follow. In the following months, the routine established around Mrs. Margaret became a source of satisfaction and personal growth for everyone involved. Julian discovered that starting each day caring for someone more in need gave a completely new meaning to the rest of his activities. Even his business began to reflect a more humanized perspective as he started to consider the social impact of his corporate decisions. Sarah flourished with the additional support and validation that her actions were truly valuable. The confidence she gained through the experience of caring for Mrs. Margaret extended to other areas of her life, and Julian noticed she was more assertive and confident in her daily interactions. Diane became an integral part of the small family that had formed around Mrs. Margaret. Her professional experience and genuine affection for the teacher created a solid foundation of healthcare that allowed the others to focus on emotional and social needs. The constant presence of caring people around Mrs. Margaret also began to attract the attention of other residents in the neighborhood. Local merchants began to offer small kindnesses. Children would stop to greet her when passing through Willow Creek Square, and other elderly people in the area began to visit occasionally to chat. The square gradually transformed from a neglected space into a small, informal community center. Julian realized that caring for Mrs. Margaret had inadvertently created something larger, an example of how a community could mobilize around its most vulnerable members. Inspired by this transformation, Julian began to consider ways to formalize and expand the model of community care that had arisen naturally. He consulted Diane about the possibility of creating a more comprehensive program that could help other people in similar situations. "What you've created here is special," said Diane during one of their conversations. "It's not just about providing medical or material care. It's about maintaining a person's dignity and human connections. That's something many formal institutions struggle to achieve." Diane's validation, based on years of professional experience, confirmed for Julian that they had developed something truly valuable. It wasn't just a solution for Mrs. Margaret's specific situation, but potentially a model that could be adapted to help others. One morning, when Julian arrived at the square, he found Mrs. Margaret in a state of unusual agitation. She was speaking rapidly about needing to go home, saying her students were waiting for her at school. It was one of the worst bouts of confusion he had witnessed. Diane arrived a few minutes later, responding to an urgent text message Julian had sent. Together they worked to calm Mrs. Margaret, using techniques Diane had taught Julian over the months. "Sometimes," Diane explained after Mrs. Margaret had stabilized, "people with dementia have episodes where they get stuck in memories from the past. For her, right now, it's still some decades ago when she was active as a teacher. Is it possible to help her come out of it? With patience and consistency, yes. But these episodes can become more frequent over time. It's important for her to know she's surrounded by people who love her, no matter when she thinks she's living." The episode served as a reminder that, despite all the improvements in Mrs. Margaret's quality of life, her condition was progressive, and there were challenges that would grow over time. Julian realized his commitment to her would need to be adaptable and long-term. When Sarah arrived for lunch and learned about the morning's episode, her reaction was one of renewed determination rather than discouragement. "She cared for hundreds of students over the years," she said. "Now it's our turn to care for her, no matter how difficult it becomes." Sarah's unwavering loyalty impressed Julian once again. There was something deeply inspiring about seeing someone so young demonstrate such commitment to a person who had entered her life by chance. That afternoon, Julian made a decision he had been considering for weeks. He would formally expand his commitment to Mrs. Margaret and begin planning a long-term future to ensure she would always receive the care she needed. His first action was to establish a special fund dedicated exclusively to Mrs. Margaret's care. The fund would be sufficient to cover all her needs for the rest of her life, no matter how her condition evolved. His second action was to consult lawyers on how to formalize the care arrangements to ensure they would continue even if something happened to him. He wanted to make sure Sarah and Diane would have the resources and authority to continue caring for Mrs. Margaret. Finally, he decided to begin documenting Mrs. Margaret's story, both to preserve her memories and to create a record of the care methods that had proven effective. Perhaps their experience could help other families facing similar situations. When he shared these plans with Sarah and Diane, both were touched by the depth of his commitment. "You don't realize," said Sarah, "how much you've changed since we started caring for her. It's not just that you're helping Mrs. Margaret, You've become a completely different person. Julian reflected on Sarah's observation as he walked through Willow Creek Square that afternoon. She was right. The man who had begun following his employee months ago, driven mainly by suspicion and curiosity, had been transformed by the experience of witnessing and participating in a pure act of compassion. His values had changed, his priorities had realigned, and he had discovered a source of fulfillment he never knew existed. Caring for Mrs. Margaret wasn't just something he did, it had become a fundamental part of who he was. One particularly beautiful afternoon, when Mrs. Margaret was having one of her more lucid days, she asked Julian and Sarah to sit on either side of her on the bench. "I want to tell you a story," she said, her voice clear and strong. "When I was a young teacher, there was a girl in my class who came from a very poor family. She often came to school hungry, and I started bringing extra sandwiches for her." She paused, smiling to herself as the memory grew more vivid. "After a few weeks, I discovered she wasn't eating the sandwiches. She was saving them to take home to her younger siblings. When I realized this, I started bringing enough food for her whole family." Julian and Sarah listened in respectful silence, sensing she was sharing something deeply meaningful. "The girl grew up and became a nurse," continued Mrs. Margaret. "Years later, when my own mother fell ill, guess who showed up at the hospital to care for her? The girl I had helped, now a grown woman, remembering the teacher who had cared about her family." She looked directly at Julian and then at Sarah. "Kindness always returns to us, but rarely in the way we expect. I never imagined my own former students and a young stranger would be the ones to care for me when I needed it most. But that's how it works. When we put love into the world, it finds a way to come back." The story touched both Julian and Sarah deeply. It was a perfect reflection on how their own acts of care fit into a larger pattern of human kindness that stretched across time and circumstance. "Mrs. Margaret," said Julian after a moment, "thank you for teaching us that caring for each other isn't a burden, but a privilege. And thank you for showing us it's possible to find family in the people we choose to love," added Sarah. Mrs. Margaret held both their hands, her own hands now stronger and steadier, thanks to months of good nutrition and medical care. "You are proof that the values I tried to teach throughout my career truly mattered," she said. "Seeing you care for me, and more importantly care for each other, is the greatest validation a retired teacher could ask for." That evening, Julian reflected on Mrs. Margaret's words as he walked through the gardens of his sprawling estate. The house that had once represented his material success now seemed less important than the small community of care he had helped create around a bench in a simple square. He realized he had learned more about leadership, compassion, and the true meaning of success in the last few months than in decades of building his business empire. And the greatest lesson of all had come from observing Sarah, a young woman who naturally possessed the qualities he had spent years trying to develop. The next morning, Julian arrived at the square with a proposal he had been considering for weeks. "Sarah," he said when she arrived for lunch, "I want to make you an offer, but I want you to know you can refuse it without any consequence for your current job." Sarah looked at him curiously, clearly intrigued. "I would like to offer you a different position. Instead of working as domestic staff, I'd like you to become the coordinator of a community care program I'm planning to create. It would be based on the model we developed here with Mrs. Margaret." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "The salary would be substantially better," continued Julian, "and you would have resources to implement the kind of compassionate care you've demonstrated here, but on a larger scale. You could help other people like Mrs. Margaret and train others to do the same." "But I don't have formal training for this," said Sarah hesitantly. "You have something more valuable than formal training," Julian replied. "You have genuine compassion, endless patience, and an intuitive understanding of human needs. Those are qualities that can't be taught." Mrs. Margaret, who had been listening to the conversation, visibly brightened. "Oh, what a wonderful idea," she exclaimed. "Sarah would be perfect for this. She has the heart of an educator, just like I did when I was young." Sarah looked between Julian and Mrs. Margaret, clearly moved by the offer and the validation. I would need to think about it," she said finally. "It's an enormous responsibility." "Of course," Julian agreed. "Take all the time you need. But know that I completely believe in your ability to do this, and Diane has already said she would be honored to work with you as a medical consultant for the program. The offer marked the beginning of a new phase in the evolution of the relationship between Julian, Sarah, and Mrs. Margaret. What had begun as a secret act of individual charity was transforming into a formal initiative that could benefit many people. In the following days, Sarah carefully considered the proposal. She discussed it with Mrs. Margaret, who enthusiastically encouraged her. She spoke with Diane, who confirmed that the care model they had developed was truly effective and could be replicated. Finally, a week later, Sarah gave her answer. "I accept," she said to Julian one morning as they sat with Mrs. Margaret, "but with one condition, Mrs. Margaret must remain our #1 priority. No matter how many other people we are helping, she always comes first." "Of course," Julian agreed immediately. "She is where it all began, and she will always be special to us." "And I want the program to be named in her honor," Sarah continued. "The Margaret Abernathy Initiative. It would be a way to honor not just her, but all educators who have dedicated their lives to making the world better." The suggestion was perfect, and when they told Mrs. Margaret about the program's name, she cried with joy. "I never imagined my name would be associated with something so beautiful," she said through her tears. "Teaching was the passion of my life, and to know that passion will continue through your work, there is no greater gift." The formal establishment of the Margaret Abernathy Initiative took several months of careful planning. Julian worked with lawyers and experts to create a proper legal structure. Sarah spent time training with Diane and other professionals to develop her formal caregiving skills, and Mrs. Margaret became an unofficial consultant, offering insights into the emotional and psychological needs of people in vulnerable situations. During this period of preparation, Mrs. Margaret's own condition continued to improve. The consistent care, proper nutrition, and especially the sense of purpose that came from knowing her experience was helping others, had a notable positive impact on her mental and physical health. She still had moments of confusion, but they became less frequent and less severe. More importantly, she had developed strategies to cope with those moments, supported by the constant presence of people who understood and cared for her. The first official client of the Margaret Abernathy Initiative was an elderly gentleman named Arthur Harrison, who had been found living under a bridge in the neighboring town. Like Mrs. Margaret, he had become lost due to mental health issues and a loss of family support. Sarah applied everything she had learned from caring for Mrs. Margaret in her approach with Arthur. With patience and consistency, she established trust, identified his specific needs, and created a care plan that respected his dignity while improving his quality of life. The success with Arthur validated that the model developed with Mrs. Margaret could indeed be adapted to help others. Soon, the Margaret Abernathy Initiative was caring for several people, each with their own unique circumstances, but all benefiting from the compassionate, personalized approach that had become the hallmark of the program. Julian found immense satisfaction in seeing his idea become reality, but the greatest joy came from watching Sarah flourish in her new role. She had discovered a true vocation and was impacting lives in ways she herself had never imagined possible. Mrs. Margaret became a regular presence in the project's executive penthouse office, offering advice and emotional support to both clients and staff. Her role evolved from beneficiary to mentor, completing a circle that perfectly exemplified the program's philosophy about how care and wisdom flow in all directions. One afternoon, approximately a year after Julian had first followed Sarah, the three of them were sitting on their familiar bench in Willow Creek Square, watching children play in the nearby playground. "Do you remember," said Mrs. Margaret to Julian, "how you used to get nervous when I asked students to share something personal in front of the class?" Julian laughed, surprised she remembered such a specific detail. "I remember. I always preferred to stay in the back of the room and not draw attention. And now look at you," she continued, "leading a program that helps vulnerable people, speaking publicly about compassion, using your position to make a difference in the world. You've become the leader I always knew you could be. And you," she turned to Sarah, "have found your true calling. You're not just caring for people, you're teaching others how to do it too. You're a teacher in your own way." Mrs. Margaret's words perfectly summarized the transformation they had all experienced. Julian had discovered that true success came from using his resources to serve others. Sarah had found a career that aligned perfectly with her values and natural talents. And Mrs. Margaret had rediscovered purpose and dignity at a stage of life when many would have considered her merely a person needing care. "Mrs. Margaret," said Sarah, "there's something I've always wanted to tell you. That first day when I found you in the square, I wasn't just passing by chance. I had just received news that my own grandmother had passed away, and I was devastated because I never had the chance to care for her properly." Tears began to stream down Sarah's face as she continued. "When I saw you alone on that bench, it was as if the universe was giving me a second chance. Caring for you allowed me to deal with the pain of not having cared for my grandmother the way I wished I had." The revelation explained the depth of Sarah's dedication in a way that deeply touched both Julian and Mrs. Margaret. It hadn't been just abstract kindness that motivated her, but a profound personal need to honor her own grandmother's memory through caring for another elderly person. "My dear," said Mrs. Margaret, embracing Sarah, "you have honored your grandmother in a beautiful way, and more importantly, you gave me a family when I thought I was completely alone in the world." Julian watched the embrace between the two women and felt a deep gratitude for the course his life had taken. If he hadn't followed Sarah that day, moved by curiosity and suspicion, he would never have discovered the extraordinary example of compassion she was demonstrating. And without that example, he would never have rediscovered the values Mrs. Margaret had tried to teach him decades before. In the months that followed, the Margaret Abernathy Initiative continued to grow and evolve. The story of its origin, a businessman following his housekeeper and discovering a secret act of kindness, became an inspiring legend in the local community. People began to volunteer, offering their own skills and resources to support the project's mission. Willow Creek Square, where it all began, was officially renovated and designated as a community space dedicated to the care of vulnerable people. A plaque was installed honoring Mrs. Margaret as an educator and inspiration for the project that bore her name. Mrs. Margaret lived to see the project's second anniversary, remaining active and involved until her final days. When she finally passed, she was surrounded by Julian, Sarah, Diane, and many others whose lives she had touched. Her departure was peaceful and dignified, exactly as she had lived the last phase of her life. Mrs. Margaret's funeral was a celebration of life that brought together hundreds of people, former students, beneficiaries of the initiative, volunteers, and community members who had been inspired by her story. Julian and Sarah spoke about how she had continued teaching until the end, demonstrating that true education never stops. After her passing, Julian and Sarah committed to continuing to expand the initiative in her memory. The care model they had developed was documented and shared with other communities interested in replicating their methods. Sarah, now a recognized expert in community care, began giving lectures and training other professionals. Her work attracted national attention, and she became a respected voice in advocating for more humane approaches to caring for vulnerable people. Julian continued to financially support the initiative, but his role evolved. He became more involved in the daily operations, using his business skills to ensure the project was sustainable and effective long-term. Most importantly, he never forgot the lessons he had learned about true leadership through service and compassion. 2 years after Mrs. Margaret's passing, Julian and Sarah were sitting again on the bench in Willow Creek Square, now joined by a new generation of caregivers they had trained. "Sometimes I wonder," said Sarah, "what would have happened if you hadn't followed me that day?" "I think you would have continued caring for Mrs. Margaret the same way," Julian replied. "Your kindness didn't depend on recognition or support. But I'm grateful that fate brought us together, because I learned so much more from you two than I ever taught. Mrs. Margaret always said that true education works in all directions," Sarah recalled. "Teacher and student learn from each other. I think that's what happened with us." Julian agreed, looking around the square that had become a symbol of hope for the entire community. Children played where once there was only loneliness and neglect. The elderly gathered on the new benches, knowing they were valued and cared for. Volunteers moved about, offering support and companionship to those in need. It was a transformation that had begun with a simple act of kindness from a young domestic worker and blossomed into something that touched hundreds of lives. And all because someone had the courage to act on her compassion, even when no one was watching. "You know," Julian finally said, "I used to measure success by how much money I made or the size of my company. Now I measure it by the number of lives we've managed to touch positively. It's a much more satisfying metric." "And much more meaningful," Sarah agreed. Mrs. Margaret always said a person's true legacy isn't in what they accumulated, but in the love they put into the world. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. It had begun with suspicion and curiosity, evolved through discovery and compassion, and culminated in a life mission that gave meaning to each day. The sun was setting, painting the square with golden hues that seemed to bless all who were there. It was a perfect ending to another day of care, service, and human connection. "Ready for another day tomorrow?" Julian asked Sarah as they prepared to leave. "Always," she answered with a smile. "There's always more love to share." And as they walked together to leave Willow Creek Square, passing by the bench where it had all begun, Julian knew he had found something far more valuable than any material wealth he had ever accumulated. He had found purpose, chosen family, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living a life dedicated to the service of others. The story of how a businessman had followed his housekeeper and discovered a world of compassion would continue to inspire others for generations. But for Julian and Sarah, it wasn't just a story. It was a way of life they had chosen to fully embrace, forever honoring the memory of the teacher who had taught them both that love always finds a way to return. End of story. This was a fictional story created to touch our hearts. Now tell us what you thought. Do you believe small acts of kindness can truly transform lives? Share your thoughts on compassion and community care. Leave your like if this story touched your heart, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories celebrating human kindness.